Okay, welcome to this new video. Today I'm going to talk about painting mediums and when I use them in my process. Now you might say, but wait, aren't all mediums just magic in a bottle? In today's video, I'm going to be talking about paint mediums. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the paint mediums I use and why I use them in my process, or the process that I practice. Now, obviously, there are a lot of paint mediums, tons of different oils like clove oil, linseed oil, walnut oil, and there are, of course, paint mediums that are just simply called paint medium with some mystery set of ingredients. And there are solvents, of course, and there are also fast dryers like alkyds, liquid, things like that. So a lot of different mediums one could use, and I'm sure many of them are perfectly viable. Maybe some are better for some processes, and others are better for another. Maybe there are alternatives to what I use that would work in the process you see me practice, but I just simply don't use them because I have the things that work for me. And I'm not going to do an overview of all of those different paint mediums. I'm going to, again, specifically talk about what I use, when I use it, and why I use it in my process. And in that way, this is sort of a technical video, like a supplement to some of my other content, so you can watch that and know what I'm using and why I'm using it. And I'll also say this, that I'm planning another video. I'm already preparing to film it as well, and it should be the next video after this one, where I elaborate on some of the problems specific to a part of my process. Now, there's a part of my process, it's the biggest part, the most important part, and we'll talk about it a little bit here in this overview, and that is the form pass, where I really make the majority of the painting. The big decisions happen, and most of the time goes into. And in that form pass, you'll see that I think of and handle paint mediums in a certain way. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But there are so many exceptions to that. If you're trying to match the paint consistency and paint quality that you see me sort of accomplish, I guess, for better or for worse in my videos, I will tell you one thing in this video that I do, but you might try that and have a different outcome for any number of variables that might include the paint surface, the palette, the brushes, the pigments, and the paint brand, even the climate, the humidity or lack thereof. Many of these things can affect that. And so you can try to do what I'm saying in this video and get a different outcome and be like, I don't get it. Like, I'm doing what he's saying and it's not working. So in that next video, which is kind of a bigger topic, we'll get to all those variations and even better solutions, things you can do to fix it. If you're getting a different outcome than what I describe here, you can try these different things. So that's in the next video, but we can't do that video unless we have this one to refer to sort of see the big picture, the big stages of my process, and the paint mediums I do and don't use at different stages to hopefully accomplish an effect and to get a look to my paint that I like. That's why I do any of this. Why I paint the way I paint is just because it's the way I like. And these paint mediums, or lack thereof at certain stages, are conducive to that overall look. Now, before I get into the steps of my process and the paint mediums, I want to tell you that there is a general principle that sort of governs or underlies some of the decisions here. Now, it's not necessarily the reason why I do what I do. I mostly like to have good handling. I like to have control. I like to be able to continue to work into my layer during that session. And I like for my paint to sort of stick in a certain way, layer to layer. And so a lot of my choices in terms of mediums and when to use them, when not to, has most to do with maximizing my ability to model form and for the paint to feel how I want it to feel when I'm painting. But I also consider a principle known as fat over lean. I know that sounds like a new TLC special, but in fact, it's a painting technique or method that is pretty common, and in fact, most of you, or many of you at any rate, are probably familiar with it. And the idea is that you want to paint fatter layers of oil paint over leaner layers. And by fatter, we mean more oil content. Fat, oil, oil, fat. So a fatter layer essentially has more oil in it, and a leaner layer has less oil in it. Now, how do you make a layer have less oil in it? You add solvent. The solvent, whether that's mineral spirits, turpentine, gasoline, don't use any of those. And anything you do use, of course, you want to use precautions. But mineral spirits, Gamsol, that's the way to go. Terpenoid, that would be fine as well. Just use ventilation, take safety precautions. Don't use gasoline, to be clear. And you use that solvent to cut the paint and to cut the oil that's inherently in the paint. And what I mean by that is when you squeeze that oil paint out of the tube, obviously it already has oil in it. It already has fillers, whatever that manufacturer has put into it, but it has oil in it, which makes it oil paint. And so it has a certain base oiliness or fatness to it. And so by putting the solvent into it, you essentially cut that oil content and you make it a leaner layer. And so maybe your first layer will be cut with that solvent and be a leaner layer. Your next layer will have a little bit more oil content because you cut it less with solvent. Maybe you don't cut it at all. And then your next layers will have more oil content by adding oil into it or paint medium into it. And by doing that, each new layer will have more oil content, and that affects the drying time. What you don't want to have is a fatter layer underneath a leaner layer so that that leaner layer cures first and that underlayer remains wet, because that leads to cracking and other bad outcomes. So that's the general principle, and that does underlie what I lay out. So that fat over lean principle, you can look it up, you can find that anywhere on the internet if you're not familiar with it, but that does sort of govern some of the choices here. So I'll begin by talking about the three main stages of my painting process, the stages that you see in most all of my videos, whether it's my reels on Instagram, which mostly focus on the form pass, my videos here on YouTube, my Patreon, my videos on my website. These stages are essentially in all of the paintings you might have seen me make in any of this content. Now, this is, of course, cutting out the drawing stage. I do that first, I transfer it. We're beginning with the actual painting process here. So once the drawing is on canvas, I begin the process by doing an underpainting. Now, the reason for the underpainting is to first eliminate the white of the canvas. I don't like to mix color. I don't like to put color down on the canvas and begin modeling form against a white canvas, because the white canvas is just so bright that no matter what I put down is going to look dark. And so I'm not going to be able to understand the relationships very well that I'm putting down. So number one, I want to eliminate the white of the canvas. Now, number two, if I'm going to do that, I might as well have something close to or in the same ballpark as the color of the area I'm going to eventually paint. Now, one might ask, why don't you paint a more robust or detailed or full underpainting? And I can make an argument for that. For me, it doesn't work quite as well. I tend to get lost when I paint a form pass on top of a very detailed or thicker underpainting. But you kind of have to find out what works for you. But even if I was doing that, I would still use what I'm going to describe here in that underpainting stage for it to be leaner than the layers to come. So keep that in mind. There are a lot of ways to underpaint. When I do it very thinly. Because I want it to be leaner than the next layers, I want it to have less oil content than it has naturally coming out of the tube, and because I want it to be relatively thin, I still want to see my drawing, I decide to cut that paint with solvent. So solvent is what I use in the underpainting stage. Now, the solvent I use is Gamsol, which is Gamblin's brand of solvent. Interestingly, the main part of my process, the form pass, I don't actually add any medium at all. I use the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube. And this is one of the reasons I really haven't made videos about mediums and different things like that, because a majority of my time, I'm not using any. Now, this does, of course, depend, again, on the paint I'm using, the paint surface that I'm using, the brushes I'm using, and of course my handling of the paint, the experience I've cultivated, for better for worse, over the decades. And so those things go into the results I'm able to get using the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube. And bear in mind, again, that paint already has oil in it. It has the fillers that are already in it from whatever the manufacturer put into that paint. So it's not as though I'm not using medium, I'm just not adding any more. And I use Winsor & Newton paint. And in the next video, we're going to talk about different kinds of paint, and not necessarily the particular brands, but what to do when your paint is too stiff and you can't get that creaminess that I have and you see in my painting videos using the paint from the tube. Or your paint is too oily and unwieldy and you can't get good coverage, you can't have that opacity you see me have in my paintings and my form passes. That's another issue, and we'll talk about how to solve that. And the painting surface, slick surfaces, rough surfaces, all of those other things contribute to this. But for me, what I use, my Centurion linen here, and my synthetic round brushes, and my Winsor & Newton paint, all of that gives me the ability to paint with the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube without adding any medium. Now, after my form layer, I very often, pretty much always have to go back in and refine things or revise things. And these are my revision layers. Now, I would love to have a single revision layer, but it often happens that I have to revise areas over and over and over again and have successive revision layers. So keep in mind that idea of fat over lean. As I do more revision layers, I need each layer to be a little bit fatter. So the first time I revise, which very often is a full new layer, I add a very small amount of medium to my paint so that it's fatter as I go in and make those revisions. If I do another revision layer after that, I add a little bit more of the medium. If I do another one after that, and it kind of goes towards being something of a glaze in the end, but hopefully I don't have that many layers. I don't like to paint in multiple layers. I think it risks deadening the surface of the paint and taking away that luminosity. But at the end of the day, you have to make the form work, the color work, and sometimes you have to just keep revising until the paint works. And so if you're doing that, remember this idea of fat over lean, or a little bit more medium or oil in the paint with each successive layer. For me, my medium of choice in this revision layer is refined linseed oil. Now, I prefer the refined over just regular linseed oil because it's less yellow. It doesn't necessarily affect its yellowing over time, but it looks less yellow out of the jar mixed into the paint. It's more fluid, it's less thick, it's less gooey, and so it really sort of maintains the sort of creaminess and the fluidity of the paint the way I like it. I don't feel like it gums up. I don't feel like it gets too sticky. I can still use it very easily. So I use a little bit of refined linseed oil. I tend to mix the mixture I need first and then introduce the refined linseed oil so it doesn't get too oily as I'm mixing it, and I can hit the color that I need first and foremost, and then introduce the oil into it, the refined linseed oil. So that's essentially what I use in a nutshell. Solvent, Gamsol, Gamlen's brand of mineral spirits, for the underpainting. For the form pass, just the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube, no additional mediums added. More on that in the next video. For the revision layer or layers, I add small amounts of refined linseed oil, more in each new successive revision layer. So that's essentially it. We're going to put this into action so you can see this broadly here on this little demo canvas, and then I'm going to show you me applying this to an actual painting just to bring it all home and for you to feel like I painted a little in this painting video. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do right here is demonstrate using just solvent, my Gamsol, to thin the paint, to cut it essentially, and wash in what would be an underpainting. So I'm going to take my brush and just put it in my solvent. I'll keep my solvent in a little jar like this, like so. You can find these at most any art store. And that's just my solvent on the brush. And I have some pale rose blush here, which is essentially Winsor Newton's flesh tint, formerly known as flesh tint, which I know. And I'm going to thin that out. You can sort of see the consistency here is a little bit like watercolor. And then this is sort of the consistency I go for when I do an underpainting, and I keep it very, very simple, like so. So I add just enough solvent, only solvent, Gamsol, to my brush, and I mix that into the paint here until it's got this consistency like that. Now, I set this up in advance so that it would be dry. This is as if my underpainting is totally dry. And at this point, let me wipe the brush clean here so that we don't have any solvent in it. I would now, and I'm not going to go down here where I just added that solvent, I'm just going to take the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube. Now you see how creamy this is, you see how flexible and easy it is to work with, and yet it's also relatively opaque, meaning I get good coverage here. Now the reason this is important is that in the next video we're going to talk about when your paint isn't like this, right? Because a big feature of my videos and the performance I get in a session, handling the paint, depends on a consistency like this. If it was stiffer, and there is stiffer paint out there, right? If you have a premium brand paint that's really dense, fewer fillers, that might be better, certainly more expensive. And that might not allow you to paint exactly as you see me painting without adding something to the paint. If you have a certain brand of paint that's really, really oily and far more translucent or transparent than this when you put it down, even from the tube, you're going to have a hard time accomplishing what I'm talking about. So we'll deal with all those things. Again, this feels like more of an advertisement for the next video, but we need this core foundation. So here we go. This is paint from the tube, and I put it on. And this would look different if I were not painting over an underpainting. It would be a little bit less robust. Let me add a little bit of white here. I have some white up here on the top of my canvas, or palette rather. This is called a palette. This is the canvas. And I'm just doing that to match closer to the color I have here. So because I'm not adding any medium and because the paint is this level of creaminess, that's the official property description, I would be able to paint into this for a good 2-3 hours and continue to add more paint, be able to blend this to sort of make it lighter here, darker here, finesse the edges and organize. And that's why I like it like this. If it was any oilier, if it had any medium in it, I wouldn't be able to paint into this for very long. If it was stiffer, it would be dragging across the canvas like too little butter on toast. And that's frustrating too, because it's very hard to sculpt and feel like you're evening out gradations that way. So that's definitely about the feel. It's about the feel. And for me, Winsor Newton out of the tube, using all of the other materials I'm using, gives me that feel. Now, we have a little jar here of refined linseed oil. And I always try to make sure it's fresh. Sometimes there's like a deposit on the bottom and I finally have to accept getting a new jar, cleaning this one out. I'm lazy. I don't like to do that when I don't have to. But right now I have relatively clean and new refined linseed oil here. And we can see this right here. And I mix the paint here. And the idea would be that I'm going back in and I want to paint back on this. Let's say this is the form layer. I know the values don't quite match. But let's say I want to go back into after the form layer. I want to revise it. Here I'm not obviously revising a little pink square, but I'm going in and I want to add a little bit more oil to it so it goes on more fluidly. And it's semi-transparent or translucent now so that we can see and benefit from what's underneath. Even though I might be wanting to change it a little bit, and I'm revising my form layer, I still want to be able to see it. So a little bit of oil in here. I'm doing it by feel. I'm grabbing a little bit. You can sort of see it's a little bit more fluid than, say, that up there before, but this time it's with oil, not solvent, and it feels a little bit more like I'm going back in and painting over a wet surface, and to whatever degree, it retains a little bit of that luminosity. Now, obviously, this would have to dry before I did another revision layer, but if I was going to do another revision layer, I would be adding more oil, and hopefully my adjustments at this point would be even more subtle, and so it'd be more oil to pigment in terms of a ratio, and so it gets fatter over leaner, but that plays out over many weeks of drying and agonizing and turning the painting around so you don't have to see it, because if you did, you might stab it, so this plays out over a long period of time with drying in between each stage. That's definitely key if you're going to layer in this manner, that each layer is dry before you begin applying what I'm talking about here. So I think you probably get the idea, but to belabor the point and to put it into more real world action, let me just show you quickly on this painting. Now this painting is already somewhat in production, but here you can see footage of me doing the underpainting, and I'm doing it exactly as I described earlier in the video. I'm just adding solvent and I'm getting sort of a watercolor consistency. That might be the best way to describe it. And I'm washing it in. I'm using a basic average tone for that area and washing it in or cutting it with the solvent, essentially making a leaner layer with that solvent, the Gamsol, mixed into the paint. And then since then, I let that underpainting dry here and I began my form pass. So all of this was painted with the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube. Again, that's my Winsor & Newton paint on my Centurion linen, my oil primed linen here, and it's all new fresh paint painted with synthetic round brushes. And so with those materials, I can get this sort of creamy, even consistency and opacity. And in practice, if I were to continue painting this, I would just continue in this manner. No medium. I have a clean brush here. I'm going to take some pale rose blush here, mix it with some titanium white, a little bit of yellow ochre, cadmium orange. I'm going to make sure my camera is recording. Indeed. And I will get a tone here. And there are a lot of things I could say about what I'm doing right now because it starts to steer very much into a painting tutorial as soon as I start actually making a painting, but I want to keep this about materials. But I'm essentially mixing and matching to that last bit of paint there. Actually mixing a little bit more yellow ochre in there and a little bit more raw umber in with it. A touch of alizarin because my yellow made it a little too yellow. And I can match that and I continue going. I slightly overlap that last bit of paint there, but barely. And I fill in that gap right there. add a little bit more white because it got a little bit more high, a little too high in chroma, I should say. And then I would essentially continue on with my form pass. And it's worth pointing out, I suppose, here that all of this area up here is completely dry. So this is from days ago, like 4 or 5 days ago. So I know it's dry. And so I'm just continuing on as if I never left off, and I'm using only the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube. All freshly squeezed paint, titanium white, yellow ochre, pale rose blush, cad orange, alizarin crimson, raw umber, and ivory black, my typical palette for flesh tones. I add some things sometimes and take away things at other times, but this is very useful. So that would be the form pass, and I would just continue on here. Now, for the sake of the video, am going to demonstrate the revision layer. I'm just getting that paint off of the brush with solvent there, not something I typically do, but we're going to pivot into a revision layer demo just for a moment here so that I can show you the use of my refined linseed oil. Now, typically speaking, there are exceptions. I wait till at least the whole face is painted before I start revising it. If there's a disaster, I will maybe fix it. You know, it really has to be far off. If it's a little bit wrong or there's something I just want to push a little bit further in terms of contrast or sculpt better or shift the hue a bit here or there, I tend to just sort of think like, okay, well, I want to do that. What would that look like? And I just wait, you know, because I could constantly be reworking areas and not making progress if I kind of slipped into that mode. So I usually just try to finish the face, then I'll revise. But I can't finish this in time for this video, or I'm not going to, I should say. So I'm going to go ahead and revise this nose. Totally dry, 4 or 5 days. I can go like this and nothing happens. Now, you could oil out the surface. That's a different video. I have a lot of mixed feelings about oiling out and ways I do it, which is a process wherein you add oil to the surface of the painting first before painting back into it. This is for, I guess, 2 main reasons. One would be if the paint dried in a very matte way and the finish changed and therefore the value changed. This is very evident in darker values or darker pigments like raw umber, ivory black. If I did large swaths of those pigments and then let it dry, the value would change quite a bit as that matte finish came to the fore. As it became more matte, it would look quite a bit different. And so sometimes you just need to restore the gloss so you can see what the actual color is there, so you're matching to it. The other reason is that when you oil out, it makes the surface a little bit more wet when you paint back into it, and that can just feel good. It can feel more fluid, like, you know, you never really stopped painting and you're painting back into a wet surface. It can simulate that feel. I'm adding oil to the paint, and so if the value hasn't changed a lot to where it's not super matte, and this is a little bit matte down here, not so much up there, then I'm not that worried about it. And I just go with a little bit of oil here. So I'm dipping my brush into a little bit of oil and I'm putting it here. And I'm going to have that on the palette. Actually, I should go over here. I don't want to mix with the oil. Sorry, I was trying to demonstrate the amount I add, but right now I'm going to mix the color I need first, which always begins with me mixing and matching what's there first. And I'm not adding the oil, so I put a little bit of oil there just to demonstrate the amount I was using, but again, I'm mixing the color without the oil, and I'm trying to match something there. Obviously, I got to get a little more yellow and a little bit darker. Now my goal would be to make the nose a little bit brighter in the brightest parts, but I'm going to mix and match what's there regardless first so that then I mix the change into it. Now I think this is pretty close, so I'm going to add a little bit of oil in here. I dip it off here on the side, and then I can sort of bring the amount I need, which is not very much in my first revision layer, because again, if you kind of think about that fat over lean, right? So you have the lean layer, you have the form layer, which is just fatter, then you have the first revision layer. I want to give room to be able to continue to layer. So if I add too much oil now, that means my next revision layer has just got to be pure oil. So I want to use as little as possible, introduce as little oil to the surface as possible. So I'm going to tap this down, see what it looks like. I don't know if you can see that here. Yeah, I guess you can. It's a little bit too light and too chromatic. So I'm going to grab a little, achromatic, too neutral. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the pale rose blush and the umber, and I'm going to see if I can get it a little darker and a little bit more chromatic. I need a little bit more chroma still. And there we go, pretty close. Now I have what is in the painting, and I can mix my change into it, and I'll add a little bit more oil. And it's, from a handling point of view, it's so much smoother and fluid and creamier than if I were to just paint with the paint at the consistency it comes from the tube for this new layer. Now there are exceptions, and like I said, next video will be the exception video. Maybe that'll be the title. Exceptions. Exceptional. I like that. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there with a blob on her nose. Actually, no, I'm not. I can't leave that blob on her nose. I can't have you all thinking blob nose every time you see the name Scott Woodell. So I'll cut in some footage here of me kind of, I don't know, finishing the nose to a degree. But, you know, I just want this video to be a reference point for the 3 parts of my process: underpainting, form pass, and revision layer, and what mediums I use or don't use and why in those different stages. So I'll be referring back to this video, and you'll have the pleasure, possibly, of hearing this abominable narration again. All right, that's it. If you like this channel, check me out, patreon.com/ScottWoodell, my website, scottwoodellfineart.com, downloadable videos, online classes, and I'll stop the sales pitch now. I'll stop the video right